Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this week three for our first lecture. I hope all of you are doing well, and why don't we just get straight into it? This week we are going to be looking at two important areas, both of which are related. But in this first part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution. And I'm going to be focusing on two particular areas, mainly Western Europe, excuse me, as well as um, the colonies in North America, and what will eventually be the United States. So we're going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution, and as you can see, the dates there, 1715 to 1900, right? So the reason why I'm giving you this range of dates, because you're like, well, that's over 150 years, right? I mean, did it really take that long? Um, what we're going to be looking at when we talk about the Industrial Revolution is that I want to make it clear to you that when we're talking about advancements, when we're talking about technology, when we're talking about new ways of thinking and approaching problems and coming up with solutions to, whether it's produce goods faster, to create a better way of life, to create more productivity, right? These don't always just happen in one place at one single time, right? They're happening all over the world in multiple ways. And it's really through the interaction that people have with one another. Remember, when people interact with each other, they share everything, whether it's diseases, ideas, fluids, right? They share everything with each other. And so, when somebody invents something, they come up with a process, they come up with a new tool, those tools are shared and then they are improved upon, they're developed. Something, triggers an idea in somebody else's mind, right? And so, for the purposes of this, what we're going to be looking at is how the Industrial Revolution and how these moments in Western Europe, along with the colonies, really was going to set off this period of rapid development and change, right? There are a confluence of factors that really contribute to why there was such a rapid and, impactful experience in terms of the part of the people and the regions in which these events took place. And we'll be looking at that because it's important to consider like the changes that our own society is going through. Especially in the areas of technology. Take AI, for instance. AI is being used all over the world, but it's being used in varying degrees. And it's also being used in terms of, how exactly it affects the way in which we go about our daily, rituals, our relationships, the way we access information, the way we remember information, how exactly we process that information, what information are we able to access. And, so often is the case is that the technology um, that is produced, oftentimes it can take, time in order to understand the effects of this technology. Well, at this moment, AI, we can see some of the, effects that are happening, whether that's our loss of, the ability in which to remember certain information, whether it's the the heavy reliance on a machine to be able to give us an answer. Or it's just the simple fact that, AI is affecting not just the ways in which we get information, but it's the way that we think about information. And oftentimes it's going to be kind of difficult to see how those effects actually play out. But we certainly do know that technology has an effect on individuals. Thus, the reason why, if you saw those recent court cases against Meta and YouTube, that you can see that individuals are recognizing that, these products, whether it is a social media platform, whether it is a posting platform, these products are designed in certain ways and their technology has an effect on us. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of those technologies and how they effectively change the direction of humanity's evolution in terms of moving from a certain type of lifestyle into another. So basically, the development of civilization, the advancement of it. So in this lecture, we're going to cover, how the revolution started, essentially. We'll also look at the characteristics, what exactly makes up an industrial revolution? Why do they call it a revolution? We're going to be also looking at if if this picture wasn't blocking it. The Industrial Revolution in the United States, and then of course, what is the consequence of that? That revolution is going to be the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. But of course, because this is world history, we're not going to be looking at specifically the United States, but because we are, you know, within the confines of this country, it's a good thing to know about some of the aspects of what the Industrial Revolution led to and what the changes that it contributed. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Um, One of the things that I want you all to know is that in any economy, there are four major resources that are needed in order for an economy to run effectively. Okay, so the first thing is that you have a resource, a natural resource. So this can be lumber, this can be coal, this can be gold, it can be water, right? It is something that you can use in order to build something else. Okay. Then you have your labor. You have people, right? Somebody that's able to do the work, right? To cut the trees down, to dig the coal, to, build the roads, right? We have a labor force that's able to do that. And of course, in our society, we have labor that is broken down into various sectors, right? You have people that you would consider, we once used this term. It's not used as often as it used to be, but there was a term when I was growing up, we used to call it between blue collar and white collar workers. And this was usually the to determine what exactly the physical type of labor that a person did. White collar work was often associated with that type of labor that you didn't put your body through immense stress. So you're not digging holes, you're not building roads, you're not you know, um, building ships or, working in a factory, right? You might be somebody who's the manager of that factory. You work at a desk. Maybe you're a teacher. Maybe you're a nurse. Now, that doesn't mean to say that your labor isn't important, but it's the way in which you perform your labor and the duties that are required. So when you would think of like the type of labor that you need for an economy, when you are in a economy that is diverse as ours, you see how many different types of workers there are. Many of you are getting your degree because you want to be able to enter into a workforce and be able to perform labor duties that allow you to use your degree to a certain extent. The third thing that is needed in any functioning economy is capital. So capital can be those goods and services. It's usually going to be what we would consider assets. So a capital is going to be something that allows the labor to be able to use in order to produce something using the natural resources. So capital could be a factory. It can be a tool. It can be a machine, right? The capital is going to be something that has some sort of worth to it, but it is far more valuable when it is put into an aspect to produce more goods, right? And so, and the fourth thing is entrepreneurship, right? So you have to have somebody that has the idea, right? They have the plans, they have the approach that you want to take. So you take all four of those. You take the land, the coal, the gold, the water. You take a body of people who can actually help you extract it. You have machines and tools and factories to help be able to produce that natural resources into an actual good or a service. And the people behind that are the ones with the ideas, right? So as long as you have all four of these, you can have this in terms of a strong economy. When one of these seems to be less than available, then what we tend to have is we have a economy that is what you would consider like lopsided, or an economy that is less developed. So, for instance, if you think about our economy, where we used to be an economy that was extremely effective at producing the natural resources for other economies. We had a huge abundance of land and resources, so we had the ability to produce agricultural crops on there. So whether this was like cotton or tobacco, or we had all of our fishing industries, we had our lumber, right? All of these are things that we can ship to other countries, and that's what they did as we were colonies. We had labor that was here, but there was also labor in Europe to help produce those goods because they are going, all of those resources, the cotton, the tobacco, the lumber, is going to be sent to these factories for production to be turned into goods. And then those goods are going to be sold to other people, all under the ideas of an entrepreneur. Okay? So just always think about that these are the four things that are really needed for an economy to be, advanced, to be one that is, productive in terms of its specializations, right? Because we've actually changed. We're actually not, it's not that we don't produce natural goods and services, we do, but our labor has changed. It's like we're not necessarily using our natural resources in terms of producing something, right? This is something that President Trump is often asked about. He's like, we need to bring factory jobs back to the United States. Well, that's because most of the factory jobs have gone to other countries where it is cheaper, according to the entrepreneurs, to be able to produce these goods. And so here in the United States, what we do is we design a lot of things, right? We're the people that are doing more of the service industries, right? So we're not doing as much labor. Do we still have people that are doing labor? Absolutely. Of course we do. We have people that, work on products. They design, they are building products, whether those are cars or washing machines, right? Or other services. But, the vast majority of that labor is actually produced by other countries, whether that's Mexico or somewhere in Southeast Asia. And so, just to understand how that works, because this is what's going to be contributing to this industrial revolution that'll eventually take place. So, when we think about why the Industrial Revolution, and we're thinking about 1750, so remember in 1750, the United States is a bunch of colonies, largely undeveloped, a couple of, major cities, but we're not talking about the population that Europe has at this time. And so, in 1750, there was several different factors that were happening throughout the continent of Europe that really gave rise to this Industrial Revolution. In particular, England was in probably the strongest position to make some of the largest strides and advancements towards becoming a really industrialized nation. And that is because of four things. So the first is that England at the time in 1750 had huge deposits of natural resources, in particular coal and iron ore, both which are needed to produce steel. And so, when you have deposits of these, major resources and they're easy to get to, right? They're not, 10,000 feet below the ground surface, right? They are readily available in this hill and this mountain right below our feet, right? And so if you have easy access to this, you can begin to have the raw materials, right? So that's going to be the natural resources part. The second is that there was a um up until, basically from the early 1700s, England was experiencing a new level of production in terms of agriculture. They had finally figured out how to max the yields on their areas of on their crops. And essentially, what it is that when you think about this. I don't know if any of you have ever been to England, but it's pretty cold, and the land is kind of rocky. It's not exactly always you have to clear all this land out of its heavy little rocks, and the soil, it can be easily exhausted if you oversaturate it with constant yields. But they finally figured out by the mid 1700s how to effectively do this. And so they were producing more food than they actually needed. So what this meant is that if you're able to produce more food, then you don't need as many people working in the fields. This means that there was a greater abundance of labor for people to do other things. Okay, so there we've got that second part of the economy. Natural resources, coal or iron ore, and other important resources, natural resources. You've which also includes like rivers, for instance, and waterfalls, things that can help power, a wheel that can help spin, a machine, right? And then you have people, right, in terms of labor. The third thing is that they also have access to a bunch of other natural resources, namely the ones that are coming in from the colonies. So whether this is rice, tobacco, 1750, not producing cotton as of yet, but it will become more so and as we turn into the 19th century. Um, but because there is this huge amount of trade in raw materials, England is poised to be able to take all these materials, take the labor that they have in their country, take the natural resources, and excuse me, and produce them in such a way that can actually create an effective output of goods and services. And so all you really needed was an individual, an entrepreneur, to come up with this idea. How could we actually do it? Finally, you have the infrastructure. And I mentioned the canals, I mentioned the rivers, right? But they also have some good modes of transportation, right? There's going to be able to move those raw materials and resources to the necessary places. So whether that's the huge ports that are located on the coast, or whether it's going to be the roads and services and bridges that are located to be able to get goods and people to where they are. So this is the reason why the Industrial Revolution really takes hold in England as opposed to France or Spain or Italy. Now, it's not that these other countries weren't also advancing as well, because remember, these ideas, they do travel. But it is largely, this combination of elements that seem to, really just strike it right for the country of England. And so that's the reason why it takes place. But when we think about, this industrial revolution, when we want to think about like, what does this mean? Like, what is a revolution? Well, it's not that when we think about resources or materials, right? It's not that we haven't had these materials before, right? We've had, coal before. We've seen the iron ore before. We've seen, rubber. We've seen textiles. We've seen all of these things. But we now have a new use for them, right? We have a new use for being able to build steel, right? Or to create steel. Why? So that we can build railways, right? We have the ability in which to build things out of iron that can hold huge amounts, immense heat. So like building a furnace, right? Building a stove, building, an engine, right? All of these are things that are able to create a new idea for these new basic materials that we have. But what if we turned it into something different? Of course, using these energy resources in a different way. So when we're talking about, coal being an energy source, we can actually use that to be able to create steel. Not just as a way to heat our house, we can use it in something else more effective. Of course, an industrial revolution also has the invention of new machines. So if you remember what was going on in the 16th century and in the 17th century with new scientific methodologies, new ways of thinking, right? That only continues to advance as we get into the 18th century. And so now more and more people were inventing machines. They were permitted to have opportunities in which they could explore new ways of production. And so, this is basically a new format for labor and for work. And when you have new machines, you have new ways of being able to produce on them. You have new people that are being able to learn how to use them effectively. And this is what creates a new dynamic in terms of the working world, right? That people become organized by the actual things that they produce, the skills that they are needed to produce those goods and services. So whether these are weavers or people that are working in steel mills or people that are working on the railroads, right? It is a division of labor that begins to be more specific because whereas before the Industrial Revolution, your labor was really tied to your skill. So you might be a bootmaker, you might be a blacksmith, you might be somebody, a carpenter or a mace or a mason. And these are skills, but you would learn these as an apprentice. But now, because of mass production of these goods and services, we can teach people how to, do one or two steps within this process, and you don't need an expert anymore. You don't need to be an apprentice for 2 or 3 or 5 years, right? Because now what you have is this division of labor where there's a specialization of function that people can actually maintain into their performance. And so, with that, you have greater opportunities in an industrial revolution where you have better forms of communication. And then finally, definitely the use of science in terms of being able to measure output, but also to be able to predict production. Okay, why didn't that click? Okay. So I had mentioned to you before, when you think about all those four aspects of an economy, natural resources, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Remember, at a time, if you look at this, like if you look at the 1820s and you look at the difference between manufactured goods and raw materials that the United States was producing, what you can see is that we were actually more likely to produce in natural resources. And it's 1820, so I can bet you that all that we were mostly producing is going to be areas of cotton, right? Tobacco, cotton, rice, lumber, all the natural resources. Do we still have some factories that are starting to develop in the United States in 1820? We do, but as you can see, that it's certainly not going to be the bulk majority of our economy. When does this change? When we have that equal aspect? Well, it's basically right there at the peak of our industrial revolution here in the United States, right there about 1895, 1900. And so what it's really interesting to know is that when you have an economy that has far more natural resources than it has in terms of balance of labor, of entrepreneurship, or the resources in which produce that. These are going to be countries where they're going to be making their money basically by selling the resources that they have. This is often the case for countries that are whether intentionally or unintentionally kept underdeveloped. And so, this would be many of the countries, like if you take the country of Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? This is one of the largest land masses in terms of country square mileage on the continent of Africa. It also holds some of the most valuable mineral resources in the world. And yet, if you were to look at this type of map, you'd probably see that the vast majority of their resources are going to be over here, that they're going to be in the blue. They're going to have high production, in terms of their GDP, excuse me, in terms of, what they're producing, right? And this is like cobalt, copper, all of the rare earth minerals, right? Gold, oil, right? All of these natural resources that they're not being refined in their country. They're not being used to be able to produce more jobs and opportunities in their country. That is being shipped out to areas like the United States, to Europe, to other developed countries to use it. And so, this is the reason why, like, that country, has problems in terms of being able to develop itself. But this is where this issue comes, is that a country wants to try to make sure that there's a balance between the resources that they have naturally in their country and then a production of a refined good that people would want to buy from them. So they don't have to rely on producing goods and services that are produced by foreign competitors and then are which sold back to them, right? That's probably the worst type of reverse economy, because all you're doing, and this was one of the big complaints of the colonists in the 1770s, is that the British were taking all of their natural resources, turning them into goods and services that they ultimately wanted, and they were charging them at a premium for it. It's like, well, wait a second. That was the resource that came from us. Shouldn't we get a discount, or shouldn't we do this? And that's what spurs, the development of wanting to build your own, companies, your own factories, your own resources. Okay. And so, okay, I'm not sure why I can't just click. So, when we think about the technology, right, that really builds off of the advancements that were happening during the 17th century under the Enlightenment thinkers, right? When we're thinking about the scientific methodology, when we're thinking about how to go come up with processes of organization, right? When we're thinking about all of those new inventions that are coming about, these are the same things that are happening during this period in Europe as well as in Europe. And so what we see is that various pieces of technology that are improving communication, that are improving the production of goods and services, and then are also improving the ways in which we produce goods and services, as well as living our daily lives. And so when we think about, the technology, I want you to think about all the technology that you've used today that we often just take for granted, right? Well, at least I hope none of you, cooked over an open fire today. hopefully you either cooked off of electric or you cooked off of gas. But that is something that had to be understood, and being able to cook on an actual stove, right? Something made of iron, this is something that develops in the 1760s. And this idea that we can be able to create something that allows to retain heat without burning down the place in like an open hearth fireplace, right? This was an advancement. And so when you have these sort of aspects, I mean, just think about all the things that improve your life and your technology. How is it that you are improved as an individual because of some sort of technology that's out there? Like, what is it that's something that you just can't do without? Think about that. Of course, one of the biggest changes to happen in Western Europe, as well as what eventually will happen in the United States, is the railroads. And the railroads really connect all of England, and they connect all of they will eventually connect all of Europe. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Europe, take the train, you know, and you will be amazed at how many places you can get with the train. Well, during the 18th century, the development of the railroads, which often followed alongside canal systems, because before railroads, the canal system was the way in which goods and services moved from city to city. That and hopefully everybody knows what a canal is. It's like a narrow strip of water that's usually running through a town or a city or on the edge of it, right? Or it's like wherever the town is. Let's say if it's on the coast, then there's like a canal that is built so that you can bring things further inland, right? That's what I'm talking about. So the railroads begin to start being built alongside the canals, right? And at first, you were able to put something on the rails that could be pulled by something on the canal, right? And then eventually we could develop the steam engine, and eventually we could have trains, and eventually, right? So, but the railroads are really what, spurs more growth. Why? Because now we can take goods and services from one end of a country to another, right? If somebody is building something that I want in the north, I can bring it down to them on the south, right? It doesn't just move goods and services, it moves people as well. So this is what creates what is known as the national market, right? Where the railroad is being able to provide people access to things that once they had to, just rely on for their local community, now they can access something. If I wanted to get something in Bristol, I can get something that is made in London and I can have it sent to me on the train, right? I could take the train and go and get it myself, right? Expansion, unification of a country, right? And, the changing nature of, what you would consider like in Europe or in the United States later on in the 19th century is like the frontier, right? The countryside is eradicated essentially because the railroad has reached it. Once the railroad has arrived, technology has arrived, the future has arrived, right? Society, civilization has arrived. And so, what you want to do is you want to think about like how exactly does transportation around here change the way that you see the world, right? If you're, fortunate enough to be able to, ride in a plane, then you've had the opportunity to see beyond, your borders here, in Baltimore or in the county. If you have a car, you're able to, go much farther, at least than me, because, it's like, have you ever tried to take the bus from, downtown Baltimore to Dundalk? Not a fun system, I can assure you. So, certainly a lot of challenges from what I learned when I was going through it. But think about how technology gives you access, right? Changes the way in which you see things, changes the spaces that you're in. Right. But of course, as I mentioned, with the agricultural development that takes place in England in terms of having greater yields, one of the other things that happens is that agricultural development, because scientists are trying to figure out ways to keep our food, fresh, try to keep the bugs off, try to make it last for market, right? There are machines that are helping to produce the yields, as well as machines and chemicals that are helping to protect it. And so this is another period where we have major agricultural developments, whether it's like the thresher system, whether it's the steel plow, whether it is fertilizers, right? All of these things are going into changes. And this is because of this is what is feeding that revolution. Why? Because if I have a new plow that is able to plow a field in half the time as my, old plow with the donkey, right? I can spend less time plowing my field and more time planting it. And if I have the ability in which to gather up all of the corn or all of the wheat, whatever the case may be, at the end of the season, and I can do it without 20 labor hands and just do it with three, I have greater yields, less people to work on that. More people can do specialization, more people can produce, more people can start to build and have other opportunities, more factories, more entrepreneurs, more opportunities for production, right? This is how, everything always fits in tandem. Technology affects agricultural development affects the yields and the types of foods that we eat. If the foods become more nutritious, if the foods are able to reach better, more people in the market, if the foods are able to sustain people longer, then they can work longer. If they can work longer, they can produce more. If they can produce more, then we can buy more, right? It's just another cycle. Okay. So it's very cool to when you think about it. But one of the things that happens as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which it is either in Europe or in the United States, is inequality. And this is because what ends up happening in terms of the positions that people take. Like, yes, people may not necessarily have to work on the farm and feed themselves in that way, but now they are dependent on an individual to pay their check, right? To produce their labor is what allows them to eat. And so, industrialization doesn't really create greater senses of equality in society, right? If anything, it actually expands it or even exacerbates it. And, this is, we should think about like where we are currently as a society. Like how exactly has AI affected industrial employment? How has the technology that was once done by humans to build a car is now done by a robot? And this had started in the 80s. Think about how AI is affecting certain jobs, right? We used to call them, they weren't called file clerks, they were called paralegals. And a paralegal was somebody that actually spent their time reading law cases and doing research and stuff for law firms. Well, we don't need that anymore because we've got AI, right? We're getting to the point where AI is already starting to either replace or at least drastically reduce the duties that we once relied on for humans. And so what we want to think about is that like technology doesn't always necessarily, make things better for us because it can often replace people's role in society. Um, but it can also become something that we might want to be critical of. Like, well, how exactly is this affecting the way in which I interact, perform, and function in my job duties? Part of this slide didn't reload. Okay, what is going on here? Okay, well, not sure why that didn't load. Okay, but no worries. So, just to give you guys a quick run through of the period that happens as a result of the Industrial Revolution, because remember, the Industrial Revolution is a combination of various aspects: natural resources, labor, capital, and then people who want to come up with a big idea, an entrepreneur. Okay. England was poised to do it. Why? Well, they have natural abundance of resources. They have a good system in which to move those resources around. They have more labor because they have less farmers, and they've got some people who've got some good ideas. And so as a result, same thing happens in the colonies, eventually the United States, because by the 1850s, 1860s, we were already demonstrating ourselves to be industrial powerhouse, right? We haven't experienced the Civil War as of yet, but what was ending up happening is that when we had very similar benefits of what was going on in our own industrial revolution, right? We had cities, we had mass food production, we had natural resources, whether that was coal, oil, lumber, or iron. We had huge immigration influx. And all of this is going to contribute to be able to create a huge and incredible output in terms of who's coming to this country and what labor can they produce. And what's interesting is that if you actually look at it, labor was usually assigned or associated by various groups, right? And so, if you looked at it in terms of like you had certain groups that worked on the railroad, certain groups that were, going to be farmers or work in the textile mills, or people were going to be laborers or merchants, right? That is very much the same thing that happens, that happens in Europe as it does in the United States, because this is where the biggest shift is, and this is why it's called a revolution, is that in the 1750s, the vast majority of people depended on the land for their survival. Now people are starting to depend on the land for their job, right? To be able to take something from the land so that they can produce it into a good, that labor that they are using to produce the good, that's why they get paid. And so it's the same thing in the United States, is that more and more people were moving away from farms and were working for wages. And most people were moving to urban areas. This is the same thing that was happening in England as well as in the rest of Western Europe. People are moving to cities. Why? Because this is where the opportunities are. More and more people are able to get there because of the transportation. And with this opportunity, this brings in labor, it brings in people who want to work. We have the resources, we have the capital, and we just have the entrepreneurs, and that's the reason why the revolution can take place. Now, of course, there are a couple people that you might recognize from this, and I'll leave these slides up so that you can know about some of the inventors that happened during this period, right? Whether that's Thomas Edison or J.P. Morgan or Henry Ford, uh, any of the other individuals that, like Andrew Carnegie right here, any of these individuals that produced, and you can take a look at all of these aspects. But the most important thing that I want you to think about is how exactly this period, what has been come to be known as the Progressive Era, actually fundamentally changes and alters society. Why? Because what we do is that this industrial revolution fundamentally moves society from an agrarian to an urban. It moves people from earning their living off the land to earning a wage. It moves people in terms of having multiple skills and abilities to having a specialization, right? It does not, right? Although there is greater productivity, higher output, the ability in which to produce more, it is not improving lifestyle, safety, longevity, right? What we're looking at is we see that everything in terms of the physical output that humans are able to do with their new machines, with their factories, with their yields from their crops is good. But what ends up happening is that there is also a divide that is taking place with people themselves. So there is not that period of equality that is happening during this era of industrialization, which is one of the reasons why the progressive era is what happens as a result, because of what was being able to because of what was happening. There were laws on the book. There was no, monitoring by the federal government in terms of income taxes. There was no laws against children working in factories. There was no workman's comp, right? There was no disability. There was nothing that said that your product had to be safe for consumption, right? None of this. And so this is the reason why I like to understand when it comes to rights, like it takes these fundamental shifts in society to be able to determine where exactly and how exactly is society progressing. Are certain people doing well? Yes. During the progressive era, there were many people that were, millionaires that were doing quite well. Such as the case like right now. We have more billionaires than we do. We have, 50%, I'm sorry, 5% of the population controlling 95% of the wealth. Sounds very similar to what was going on in the Gilded Age and during the Progressive Era. So when we see this expansion of rights, we want to be able to understand what exactly causes that shift. Because when you have fundamental changes in your systems of organization, your systems in terms of food production, your systems in terms of societal structure, your systems in terms of your living, your lifestyle, your behaviors, the ways in which we interact with each other. But what we don't see is greater protections, advancements, or improvements within our own physical abilities. That's when we see the changes. And this is what we're going to see is why exactly these are those changes that need to be taking place as a result of it. Okay. So what I want you to do is take a look, at the links and some of the changes that were taking place, and then, let me know what you think. Okay.